Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is going to be our fifth and final presentation for our Book to Action Riverside Reads event taking place. Before we get going, I just want to go over a few things. We will be posting a survey in the chat throughout the event. If you get a moment, please go ahead and fill that out for us. This is a great way for Center for the Book to get great feedback and provide future programs for the public that we can participate in. And also, there's a Q&A section. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send that through. We will have two moderators filtering those questions to our presenter today. With that said, I'm going to kick this off to Erin Christmas, who's going to introduce everyone.
Thank you, Joseph. It is absolutely my pleasure to thank everyone for joining us this evening for the final presentation for Riverside Reads 2021. This presentation is made possible by California Center for the Book, which is a program of the California Library Association, supported in whole or in part by the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services under the provisions of the Library Services and Technology Act, administered in California by the State Librarian. This year's series is based upon Choosing Civility, a book by P.M. Forney. And this book exemplifies the City of Riverside's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. For years, Riverside has demonstrated that it values inclusivity. Our city can be proud of its efforts, from the Mayor's Multicultural Forum to the inclusivity statement that guides everything we do, to the annual Carlos E. Cortez Award for championing diversity and inclusivity. As defined by P.M. Forney, civility means a great deal more than just being nice to one another. It is complex and encompasses learning how to connect successfully and live well with others, developing thoughtfulness and fostering effective self-expression and communication. Civility includes courtesy, politeness, mutual respect, fairness, good manners, as well as a matter of good health. Taking on an active interest in the well-being of our community and concern for the health of our society is also involved in civility. Tonight's discussion of social movements will be led by Vice Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of California, Riverside, Miriam Lam. Professor Lam was president and a longtime board member of the Riverside Asian American Community Association, has served on the boards of Third Way Human Rights and Development, Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association, Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, Global Village Foundation, and on the grade 7 to 12 Vietnamese American Curriculum Project for the Orange County Asian Pacific Islander Community Association. She earned a bachelor's degree in English, a minor in Spanish, and master's and PhD degrees in comparative literature with certificates of emphasis in feminist studies and Asian American studies from UC Irvine. In her role as the UCR Vice Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Lam advises the leadership team, including the Chancellor, on all issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sets the vision and course for positioning UCR as a national leader in reimagining diversity in higher education. She heads a wide range of initiatives and committees that address DEI, partners with campus and community stakeholders to advance UCR's diversity mission, and represents UCR at the system, state, and national levels. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to this amazing guest speaker, Dr. Miriam Lam. Miriam.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thank you to the whole team for inviting me in the Riverside Reads project. Thanks to Erin for giving me a tour of the new main library last week. That was really exciting. Can't wait till we're, frequenting it in person. And a couple of weeks ago, when I did the more introductory, all the vocabulary around diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, and inclusive excellence, and those kinds of things, privilege, fragility. I thought we might change it up today. And so Aaron and Joseph and folks have asked me to talk about social movements. So I'll cover quickly some of the more familiar social movements, but I didn't want to take up too much time, since many of you, especially folks who have been around during the 60s and 70s and such, will be even more familiar having lived through it. I was born in 72. And so I thought I'd spend some time focusing on two movements, which I'll go into in a bit. So I'm going to share my screen, and please, because when I share my screen, I won't be able to open the chat. So our two moderator folks will check on that for me if you're shy about speaking yourself, but please feel free to unmute yourselves and just interject questions or asks for clarification, anything like that. I hope this is interactive, and I'm going to be showing some video clips and such in between as well. So if you have some, strong reactions to it, I want to hear from you. So feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in whenever you feel like it. And if there's any tech problems, if you can't hear the video, please let us know also. I'm going to minimize that. All right. So just as a bit of background in terms of social movements, we feel on our campus, and I think Riverside as a whole feels, that diversity isn't philanthropy, right? It's not something we do as charity, right? That it's part of everyone's responsibility to kind of uplift and build a sense of community and a sense of inclusivity and belonging. And that this work itself is, continuous, indefinite. There's no endpoint, no promised land, right? And that it requires kind of ongoing, intentional coordination and mobilization towards a kind of larger goal of social justice. And so I think diversity itself, diversity work, is already very consistent with a kind of social movement in itself. And just as a reminder, because I think the importance of social movement histories and such are that they're trying to affect change and intervention on not just the individual level, right? Because we know there are all kinds of overt and covert forms of individual discrimination, but that social movements address sort of the institutional and systemic forms of discrimination and inequity that we may not really think about on the day-to-day level if you're in a more advantaged position, right? And so social movements help focus our attention on the kinds of inequities that we may not think about regularly, but that affect all of our lives, right? Including those that we love and those who we may not even come into contact with regularly, but we know the effects on their lives and livelihoods, right? And so the two examples of social movements I was going to share with you today are really attempts at reaching intervention or change and transformation at the institutional and systemic levels. And so I was going to use a really general one, education, as a kind of social movement. People don't tend to think of it that way. And then one that is close to Riverside, since Riverside as a city recently declared racism as a public health crisis. And so I was going to spend some time talking about that. But some of the more familiar social movements, right, you may know about or have lived through and continue to live through are the women's movement, right? And we talk about the women's movement often in terms of the three, historically, we used to talk about the three feminist waves, right? So in the early days of the suffragettes and the fight for women's rights and women's equality, women's right to vote, right, and such, right? And then subsequently we had the women's movement in terms of equal rights, and often the movements aligned with the civil rights movement in terms of recognizing women and underrepresented minorities as secondary class citizens, and really recognizing the inequities and inequalities that existed during that time. And then often people point to the sort of 60s and 70s women's liberation movement and burning of the bras and using speculums to look at our body parts and such as this kind of third wave of feminism, right? And during that third wave of feminism over time, that was when the National Organization of Women now began. And so you see prominent figures like Gloria Steinem and such as part of that. If you may have seen the recent movie, The Three Glorias or The Glorias, Kimberly Guerrero, who's one of our theater faculty and Indigenous, played the Native American activist leader in the movie. So we were very proud of her. But during that time, there was a lot of, kind of supplemental criticism about that movement being led by more often middle class, white, upper middle class white women in particular, and to sort of attempt to diversify that women's movement at the time, right? And so focusing on global feminist attempts and women's experiences in different global contexts, looking at ethnic minority women and racial minorities women in the US, right, as well, and different socioeconomic classes and the different kinds of experiences that women experience due to different intersectional layered forms of inequity, right? And so often people will refer to that as a kind of fourth wave of feminism. And so together, especially the third and fourth waves intermingle quite heavily with the civil rights movement. And so most folks are more familiar with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and that this, builds off of a longer history of slave abolition and the kind of alignment of racial politics with feminist politics. And, this was during the Vietnam War in the US context. And so a lot of the anti-war sentiments and, thinking about our veterans and such, fighting in foreign wars and such, really culminated in a lot of social anxiety and angst and political unrest at home and abroad, right? And so most people, when they think of social movements, they think of that period, right? This was also when a lot of the labor movement, United Farm Workers and such, were organizing in that period and the subsequent decades after that. And so the combination of these movements led to a lot of what we think of today as kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. But it was during this period that colleges and universities, Kent State, right, Berkeley, were demanding our colleges and universities, our educational system, requiring more curriculum and education knowledge production about different communities, and not only historically well-known and European and Western, frames of knowledge and such, but really thinking about the rest of the world in which we inhabit and all of the folks in that world. And so ethnic studies scholarship, which, as you know, with the different legislation, with the Cal State system requiring ethnic studies curriculum now, the different bills that have been struggling with one another as well as to get passed, you can see that there's a long history of tension and struggle around even just incorporation of educational justice frameworks, right? And then, of course, affirmative action and equal opportunity, first came into law under JFK Jr., and it was an attempt to address already existing forms of discrimination and inequity and obstruction in employment practices as well as admissions practices, right, for colleges and universities and such, in terms of who could study there, right, who could get in and who would get hired and such. And of course, over the years, often corporations and institutions incorporated that in not very strong infrastructural manner, right? Often the affirmative action offices, EEO offices, ended up being kind of places people would go to report things in the aftermath of discrimination and such. And so people would use funding patterns and such from federal affirmative action opportunities and such, and turn it into a kind of numbers game, right? And so it would get criticism as, oh, it's all about quotas, right? And then a kind of dismissiveness towards the efforts altogether, right? And so you saw a lot of this backlash in the 80s and 90s against these attempts to address inequity, sort of positing it as a form of reverse discrimination and such, right? And so those kinds of tense political arguments around something that was meant to be a kind of a social justice, educational justice movement. And so then by the 80s and early 90s, you have these notions of multiculturalism, right? Instead of talking about affirmative action and EEO, that was too controversial at the time, let's talk about multiculturalism, because that sounds so innocent and unoffensive and, rainbows and butterflies. And so we'll talk about the melting pot, right? In social sciences and sociology, which we would talk about, all of our cultures just melting together into one lovely soup. And then of course there were criticisms that that's a form of assimilation, right? That everybody was expected to become the same and homogenous and often more mirroring whatever mainstream culture or society already existed, which would tend to just perpetuate the status quo. And so you have those other metaphors like the mixed salad bowl, that we could all be different components and ingredients in a tasty salad, but that we could all retain our cultural shapes and practices and still have the piñata at our quinceañera, or, the assumption was that then we would all live in this happy, culturally diverse, multicultural space, and not really addressing the kinds of problematic, tense moments of cultural contact and still existing socioeconomic inequalities, and the way often racial groups are pit against one another and such. And so, now more has been made to kind of turn towards notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the equity part still focuses on a lot of the ongoing work that needs to be done in order to actually get folks to the same level of success and thriving and such, right? And that inclusion is it has to be intentional. Like, you don't just have diversity and then everyone gets along, right? That inclusion is it's an ongoing practice of welcoming and grace and withholding judgment and really working to continue understanding one another better, right? And so if you don't have any questions about these more historical movements, these are additional social movements that we could have spent our time on, right? So I'm not going to go through all of them, but abolition is one that's in a hot ticket, a hot button issue these days, right? With police abolition. And often people get very upset when you just talk about abolition as a notion and don't realize that abolitionism as a movement is not just about police abolition, right? That it has a much larger framework of everything from critiques of the prison industrial complex to really trying to chip away at the structures that have maintained their sort of power relationships since the days of slavery, which is why abolitionists chose this term abolition. So it's not just to sort of trigger folks, but it's to actually connect it to the history of the slave trade and its effects on the US. So most people don't know that the law enforcement in the US was originally designed to go and capture runaway slaves, right? During the early American period of the colony. And so abolitionists working on police abolition, for example, want to intentionally call upon that history so that people recognize that that's the concern, right? That some of the practices in law enforcement continue from those histories and that kind of punitive disciplinary mechanism of training and such and all of that. And so I think if you don't know the larger history, it just seems like some outright, going after or targeting a particular occupation or what have you without the bigger context, right? And of course, that movement is tied to Black liberation movement, right? Different kinds of school to prison pipeline concerns, right, about discrimination in everything from K through 12 education into our criminal justice system and such. And so, you know, another term that often gets unfair shrift is decolonization, right? Whenever people hear anything about decolonization, people automatically feel like, oh no, people want to take back our home ownership and private property. And, you know, I had nothing to do with my ancestors colonizing indigenous land and all of that. And so for some reason, this kind of reaction takes effect when decolonization is also an attempt to chip away at the remaining legacies embedded in many of our institutional and systemic practices from the days of colonialism that we don't recognize still having an effect on us, right? And so, but I'm gonna move now to the education as a kind of social movement. So any questions on this before? So when we talk about decolonizing higher education, for example, I'm going to focus on colleges and university because that's my more familiar area. Universities themselves, right, were often built on empires, right? And so universities often relied on colonization in order to continue their work, right, and to maintain justification for their work. So, for example, I'm being, you know, intentional in my use of Ivy League universities and such, but Princeton raised money and recruited students through rich families who owned enslaved people, right, in the South and Caribbean. Brown's governing board captained slave ships. Their donors lent enslaved people to help with campus construction, right? Harvard was established on stolen indigenous land left by a wealthy plantation owner. And the children of the slaves were served, or enslaved people were used to serve the children of the wealthy white folks on campus, students and faculty. And, you know, the reason why we have many African-American and other communities of color afraid to take the COVID vaccine, for example, is because there's a long history of Black bodies being used in scientific experimentation, from fertility treatments and infertility to all kinds of other medical experimentation, right? And so, but this is not to, you know, give a free pass to public institutions. So for example, UCR and many of the UC campuses always read our land acknowledgements to our 4 indigenous tribal communities because many of the UC campuses are land grant universities that, you know, have placed themselves on indigenous lands and such, and to acknowledge that history and to, you know, pay ongoing homage and gratitude to that history is part of an attempt to decolonize that history of higher education, right? And not see indigenous Native American populations as somehow stuck in this moment of history only, because as we know, these are thriving and living peoples who are still struggling and such, right? Due to many of these legacies. And so Paolo Ferreira, who's one of the leading figures in educational scholarship and his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I just am giving you Cliff's Notes versions of the 4 chapters, because the notion of decolonizing education, if we think about, historically, often people think about education as a way to uplift yourself, right? Create higher income for you based on the kinds of occupations you could acquire after, so that you can help your families and yourselves with socioeconomic mobility and such, right? And so that kind of economic ascension, if we kind of think about that, right, as the ultimate end goal of education, is can perpetuate hierarchies, right? So you'll have an educated class and those who do not receive the education, right? So over time, you'll have a class of wealthy, educated people and a class of less or poor, uneducated people, right? And so this notion of a pedagogy of the oppressed and the oppressors, right? And so there's a real contradiction in that, because the assumption is that, well, you have an instructor in the classroom or a teacher, and they're the master imparting the knowledge onto an apprentice, right, or the student, and that there's a kind of power structure hierarchy already in that relationship in the classroom, right? And Ferreira is talking about, if we think instead of education as a tool of liberation and freedom, right, working towards liberation and freedom for all of us, for humanity, as opposed to tools of hierarchy or oppression, that education is about self-achievement, right? And or not about just self-achievement, but it's a mutual process for everyone involved in it, right? So instead of thinking of education as a banking concept, right, in terms of like capitalist enterprises and money making endeavors and such, which can become an instrument of oppression, right, if it's all about sort of who's making more bank, right? If we think instead about education as this instrument for liberation, then everything that happens in the space of the educational process, right, is about helping those individuals together become more complete human beings, right, become more well-adjusted, mutually respectful and supportive humans in a society that wants good for all of its people, right, and not sort of differentiating between those with education and those without, right? And so that kind of liberational approach to education would require a much more dialogical or discussion-oriented, interactive kind of back and forth dialogue in terms of education, right? And so instead of thinking of this master faculty member or teacher teaching down to students, right? The assumption would be that those students in the classroom, because of their varied backgrounds and histories, have just as much to educate one another and the instructor as the instructor would have with them, right? And so that relationship, that dialogical relationship, can generate all kinds of new discussions and themes that can be really generative for everyone in that classroom, in that space, and that together they are awakening different kinds of critical consciousnesses, right, that may not be found in the curriculum in the textbook they're required to use in that K through 12 school district, for example, right? There may be other forms of knowledge, other storytelling practices, other histories and cultural lineages and legacies that might be brought into the space of the classroom that could really uplift and educate that classroom, right? And if you think about it that way, as education as this dialogical process, education can happen anywhere, not just in the space of the classroom, right? It can happen in the Riverside Main Library or any of the other local libraries, right, in our county. It can happen when you're at the park together, right? It can happen in places that don't perpetuate hierarchical notions of knowledge production. And so if we kind of think of moments where people resist dialogue, right, especially around hot topic issues, right, that's a very anti-educational, anti-dialogical approach, right? It's actually, if you refuse to talk about these difficult things, right, it's often meant to perpetuate the kind of divisiveness and hierarchies that already exist, and having a hard time being willing to dialogue through those difficulties, right? And together, cooperatively coming to some better synthesis of where you could be in terms of a cultural position as a collective group together, right? And so I want to show you a video of a story that was ripped from the headlines in Akron, Ohio.
Every parent wants to give their child the best education possible. One Ohio mom is currently sitting in jail, accused of illegally trying to get her daughters into a better school district. Should she be serving time, or was she justified? Our Andrew Canning is here with more on this mother's crime and her punishment here. This is going to really light up our message board.
Yeah, it is a big, big debate right now, Robin. Kelly Williams-Buller is serving a 10-day sentence. She falsified residency records, and prosecutors say a private investigator even caught her red-handed on video living in the wrong district. Buller says all she wanted to do was help her daughters escape their crime-ridden Akron neighborhood.
It's overwhelming. I'm exhausted. I did this for them. So there it is.
Kelly Williams Bowler's decision to try to give her daughters a better life has now landed her behind bars. It started 4 years ago when Bowler, who lives in a poorer section of Akron, Ohio, sent her daughters to a highly ranked school in a neighboring district. The problem is, it wasn't her district, it was her father's, and her children weren't eligible to go there. She says she did it to keep them safe and that she lived part-time with her dad.
When my home got broken into, I felt it was my duty to do something else.
But school officials said she was cheating, getting a quality education for her daughters without paying the right taxes to fund it.
Those dollars need to stay home with our students.
The school system says Bowler lied about her address, falsified records, and when confronted, had her father file false court papers to game the system. The district even hired a private investigator to follow her. She was ordered to pay $30,000 in back tuition, but refused and was indicted.
Ask yourself, why would you believe a word she told you understand?
Bowler claims she was singled out.
This is not a murder trial. It's not.
I felt that some punishment or deterrent was needed for other individuals who might think to defraud the various school systems.
My girls need me. I've never, ever went a day without seeing them off. Never.
The case has now divided a city.
Why they chose this particular young lady, this particular girl, and not anyone else.
And left many wondering how far a mother should go to give her children a better life.
I don't think they wanted money. I think they wanted me to be an example.
100 other families were investigated at the same time as Bowler. 3 agreed to stay and pay tuition. The others either proved they were residents of the district or admitted guilt. Only Bowler fought the school district.
And she wants to be a teacher, and now that could be in jeopardy.
She is only 12 credit hours away from her teacher's license. Now that she's been convicted of a felony, that is in jeopardy. She's also a teacher's aide, and her job, of course, is in jeopardy as well.
How much money are they spending trying to go after these families?
They spent thousands of dollars on the attorney fees and the private investigator fees. They claim, though, that the taxes that they're losing from these people is much more than that.
And if you talk, I mean, it's buzzing right here in our studio right now, and people are very aware of yes, it's not you're not supposed to do that, but people do it because they're just trying to get their kid a better education the best way they can.
School districts are a hot button issue for people.
Absolutely. The president talked about that a lot in the State of the Union. Andrew, thank you so much. And we would love to hear from you, both sides. Please weigh in. Let us know what you think, how you feel about this. Every parent.
So you can see the politics involved in just something. And I mean, I can't tell you how many colleagues I know who have family relations claiming, you know, addresses in Irvine to get into the Irvine School District or Claremont and all of that. And so it's clearly a phenomena that happens all the time, a phenomenon. And, you know, in terms of only 3 families paid up, which is 90 grand, right? And given the attorney fees and such, I'm sure it far exceeded 90 grand. And so if you think about the politics of, you know, making the example or going after, you know, this individual and such, you have to kind of wonder, how is education being used in this context, right? Is it a means of liberation for all of us as a society, or is it used to continue to hierarchize and divide us from one another, right? And so I'm going to show you another kind of, you know, academic talking heads talking about what it means to decolonize education.
To decolonize education it means working on multiple fronts. So I think we're working at a very kind of large scale changing of the education systems and structures, you know, advocating for changes to the Ontario College of Teachers, description of what education is and how it includes Indigenous perspectives and knowledge. And it also means working in our own structures and making changes where we can make the changes directly.
Decolonizing education is a phrase that we hear a lot about in social work. So when I think about decolonizing education, I think in a basic sense, there is a colonial agenda that has set out a way of educating and the educational system to fit that agenda. And the way that we experience that on a day-to-day basis is around things like what is accepted as authoritative knowledge, what knowledge even counts, where the standards are, what ways are acceptable in terms of learning and being and speaking and representing. So all of these things, right, that all fit neatly into an agenda that preserves privilege for a very small group of people. And even though that's a very small group of people, it also keeps those of us that don't fit into that agenda feeling less than, especially in a space like a university, right? So we are the people who are doing work that's on the fringes, the work that's alternative, that's maybe complementary at best, right? So that language should really sort of reinforce that what you're presenting, what you're representing, what you're interested in is not the real knowledge, it's some kind of other thing that's happening. To me, decolonizing education means, first of all, making that visible and making it visible to people that what is presented to us as truth and as authoritative knowledge is just one of many knowledges, one of many truths.
For me, decolonizing education would have to have at least 3 components. One is to really raise the question in terms of what are we learning? From whom? What do we think is the canon, the tradition as universal knowledge? And ultimately at universities, that is usually based on Eurocentric knowledge. Which gets to the second point. When we foreground certain kinds of knowledges, which ones do we marginalize? Which ones do we not take into account seriously? And I would say these are knowledges from indigenous communities, from marginalized communities, those from the global south. And we need to constantly insist on establishing, developing knowledges, bringing in faculty members whose perspectives will diversify our curriculum. And third is fundamentally then, how do we infuse and integrate those 2 components so that when we deal with certain kinds of Western Eurocentric knowledge that have been core of our knowledges, of our research, of our teaching, yet at the same time foreground the ones from indigenous and marginalized communities, how do we bring them together so that we can move forward as a global community in the 21st century?
You know, and which they're talking about Western Eurocentric education, but this isn't to say that if you studied ancient East Asian scholarship, right, you wouldn't also find all kinds of patriarchy and sexism and such too. But the fact that we don't actually learn about that form of patriarchy, right, and so we're still sort of limiting our knowledge base, right, in the way we frame it. So now I'm gonna show you what fighting over classroom curriculum and what we should be doing for our students looks like.
Dahlia, what does it mean to decolonize academia and university curriculum?
Well, that's a very big question. To me, there are 3 main pillars. So the first pillar is about decolonizing our curriculum, which is not just, it's kind of presented as, you know, students wanting to kind of take out key seminal figures out of our curriculum, but really it's about contextualizing figures that we might look to as being neutral or seminal and actually contextualizing them within their colonial context, as well as also drawing from marginalized groups as part of our kind of basis of knowledge. It's also about changing the structure of the university to make it more accessible and more democratic. And it's also about looking to the welfare and representation of students of color in all throughout our university system.
So I think it's absolutely right in universities that you should be looking at a wide range of sources and actually questioning, are the traditional sources the right range of sources? I think as the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party for Women, making sure that, for instance, you're studying things that women have written as well as men writing, simple stuff like that to broaden horizons. So I don't think you should do this at the exclusion of focusing, for instance, on the absolute priority, on the priorities for the Office for Students at the moment, which is the attainment gap, and making sure that attainment and making sure that you have quality of opportunity through universities and outcomes for all students. That is a very high priority, and I wouldn't want us to talk too much about this curriculum question when what really matters is students graduating with good qualifications.
Right, so it's not the focus. Well, I think those 2 things are very connected, because part of the reason why a lot of students of color are alienated from their education system is because it doesn't represent the histories that they come from. So I don't think that those are necessarily different issues, and we're going to have someone on later to talk about mental health. I think mental health of students of color plays into this as well. The fact that, you know, racism, as in all parts of society, is also rampant in a lot of universities and within the curriculum.
Right, Michelle, what do you think?
So it's a kind of a high level debate they're having, right? But it's important because there's this notion that, oh, if you just change the curriculum or the authors you're reading in the classroom or whatever and have them more diverse, that somehow this means that all students will succeed, right? And so the other speaker, the second speaker, was saying that we should really also be focusing our attention on their success and whether or not they graduate and how many folks we graduate and at what rates and all of that. And the first speaker is trying to explain that student success is not only about you know, their ability to perform well academically, but many students do not perform well academically because of the kinds of microaggressions they experience in the classroom, the kinds of basic needs, extended family care, right? If they're houseless or homeless, right? If they don't have enough food to eat and, you know, are struggling, right, to focus, right, in terms of mental focus and such, right? And so student success and matriculation and graduation rates have everything to do with everything that goes on in the classroom and not just about the academic content and the curricular content, right? And so I think that this debate actually alerts us to the fact that students come to the classroom, as do instructors, as full human beings, right? They're not only there as brains, but they're there as full embodied folks with backgrounds. And so we have formerly incarcerated and system impacted students, undergrad students, as well as grad students on our campus. And they'll tell us things like, I was taking a political science class because I want to get my law degree after and help, you know, be a defendant for, you know, folks in the criminal justice system and such. And every time I'm in class, the professor just keeps referring to folks as ex-cons and convicts and ex-cons. And it's a really demoralizing, you know, experience for me to sit there every day as somebody who was formerly incarcerated. And, you know, he eventually drops the class, and which is one of the core requirements, right, for the political science degree. And so how does the space of the classroom affect everything of the student trying to acquire that education, right, as a means of liberation? Was there something in the chat folks wanted to add? Feel free to jump in.
Yes, I have a question, Miriam. This one asks, what have you seen done to address this so far? And I'm sure each district is different. I believe they might be talking about school districts.
Yeah, and so UCR, our Grad School of Education, does partner with Riverside Unified School District and such. And so I know on our campus, as well as what they're trying to do in RUSD, is to train the instructors, right, as well as professional staff training and requirements around bias, microaggressions in the classroom and such, right, so that people begin to recognize the kinds of harm they might be doing, often unintentionally, because we all, you know, come with our backgrounds and say things we don't realize are offensive because our families have been saying those statements or jokes or phrases for, you know, decades, but that really take their toll on the psychological safety of our students in the classroom and how well they perform and such, right? I'm going to show you some other examples of what instructors and institutions can do to improve the consideration of all individuals as social identities, right? Not just as students, or as faculty or instructors or teachers, but that they come with their full embodied lives, right? So we know from teaching evaluations and such that when, say, white men teach about diversity and such, their evaluations are fine. When women, including white women and women of color, teach about diversity, same content, they get heavy criticism against them. So there are already assumptions made about, oh, well, they're biased, right? Whereas white men who are also promoting diversity don't seem to be treated as biased in that way, right? And so there are already kinds of inequities and power relations. And so this is, I think we're going to skip this, but you can read it in the video, but it's just about how to move people from really a kind of naive notion of critical social consciousness and like, whoa, we're just all individuals. There are dominant people and, you know, less dominant people and such. And then moving to kind of acceptance of, you know, power dynamics in the society, moving to notions of, oh, how could we actually resist that, right? And then how could we redefine not just our own identities, but the social structures and systems in which we live, and then really trying to meld those aspects of ourselves and our social lives together as a way of really participating in social movements. So some of the inclusive pedagogy practices, again, to answer the question earlier, not just selecting content that engages like a diversity of ideas and perspectives and examples that people use, right, in the classroom or when you're talking about things. Don't just use the typical examples, right? Oh, Shakespeare, this and that, right? Well, interesting, because Shakespeare, like Othello, for example, is about the Moors, and it's not until Lawrence Fishburne's version of Othello that people started realizing and talking about Othello as a Shakespeare piece that actually had a lot of racial politics embedded in it, right? And so think about even just the way we talk about canonical figures differently. It's not like we need to throw out Shakespeare, right? It's about how to contextualize him differently, right? That could be much more inclusive and bring more people into the conversation, right? When you make examples in the classroom or say things like, oh, bring your girlfriend and boyfriend to class if you feel like it. Don't assume a heteronormative relationship there, right? When you don't assume gender binary pronouns, right? And so just the way we also facilitate different students' ways of learning, right? Some students are insecure about their communication skills. They may not participate much in the way we want them to orally in the classroom, but they may have wonderful journal writing or, wonderful write-ups, or they, especially in this remote context, giving them different email options or other alternative assignments where they could flourish, right, in a way they might not flourish that's acceptably traditionally in the classroom context. Also, rewriting your syllabus, right? In the college classroom, we often include things like, here are all the campus resources, the Student Disability Resource Center, here's the counseling and psychological services. So students know that if they need help, the instructor and the university or the campus is there to also provide them these services, and they don't have to be afraid to ask for that help. The instructor is not going to think less of them for needing help, right? Clarity, right? They sound like a Brene Brown kind of thing, but the clearer you can be in your expectations and explaining assignments, deadlines, really reminders, right? All of these things show your care for the educational process, right? That it's not just about ramming knowledge down your throat, but that it's meant to be this respectful exercise and engagement that people want to do, right? That it's not drudgery. And thinking about decentering the authority, right? Valuing, giving validation to what students bring, right? Even if it's an example that maybe is not exactly related to the point you're trying to make, but you can help them turn it, steer it towards the point you're trying to make, right? And so they feel part of the contribution to the intellectual production, right? And then really in terms of being accountable and assisting them when they need, having different kinds of office hours and help, right? Additional activities like icebreakers and, storytelling is very less intimidating for folks, right? People may not write a formal essay very well yet if they haven't mastered the 5 funnel paragraph, but they may be very comfortable telling a story about what happened in their family over the weekend, right? And then you can turn that story into an educational processing of whatever topic you're working on that day in class, right? Often students are afraid to talk in the big classroom, but small group work allows them to be more comfortable and it's less intimidating. Students love extra credit more than their own assignments. I always joke about having a class that's just all extra credit assignments, no regular graded assignments. People, go ahead, Nancy.
I'm sorry, there is a question.
Okay.
In reference to K-12 grade schools, the pandemic proved that private schools handled the return to the classroom much earlier and more confidently What are your thoughts on freedom of choice so the states can vouch for private school? And what are the advantages or disadvantages for choosing private education?
Well, it's interesting that the question also used the notion of choice, right? Because the assumption is that you always have the choice to choose private education or public education, right? And we know financially it's not always a choice for many families. And so that notion of freedom to choose is already kind of loaded with different assumptions, right? And then when you are in a private educational system, you have resources that would actually make things possibly easier, right? You have, you can pay your instructors better. You can have more hours in terms of like 2 hours a week with the instructor in the classroom, 2 days a week versus having 5 days a week of 3 hours each day, right? And so as you can imagine, that resource itself creates very different kinds of inequities for the families who then have the children at home, right? The rest of the not 2 hours, 2 days a week versus the families that have them only, you know, not 5 days a week, 3 hours a day, right? What does that mean for the rest of the family dynamics for all of those families in those schools, right? And so I'm not sure I'm answering the question, because I think some of it is choice in terms of those private schools have more choice in their, other than being beholden to county public health guidelines and such, they have more freedom to make that kind of decision making about how much return to campus looks like versus public school districts that are liable for the health and safety of those students, because there isn't a choice, right? And so those school districts and the public schools need to be much more careful because they are held liable for the safety of those students, right? Whereas in the private institutions, the liability falls on the parents and the families themselves who made that choice. Does that answer the question? Feel free to add more throughout the workshop or session. And so other things you can do is, people say students get very intimidated by large grading assignments, like if you have 5 chapter exams or, you know, just a midterm and a final versus 10 weekly quizzes or something, right? That they often perform better on the less intimidating, when you call it a quiz versus as an exam, they already tend to do better because of the fear factor involved, right? And so scaffolding exercises, or don't expect them to read the whole novel, have them read 2 chapters this week, 3 chapters the next week, right? These are, and then the way you grade them, there's students often have you know, if instructors can encourage a kind of growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, people tend to assert, oh, if they did poorly on a test, oh, you failed or you succeeded, right? If you get an A, that means you succeeded. If you got a C minus, that means you failed, right? Whereas seeing anything you do, if you tried an experiment and it didn't work, your chemistry assignment didn't, the volcano didn't erupt or what have you, that is still a growth exercise. If you could figure out, oh, why didn't the volcano erupt, then you actually are still growing, because the next time you build that volcano, it's going to erupt, right? And so that kind of encouragement about not doing something correctly or with the outcome that was desired doesn't mean you failed, right? It means that you just learned something that you're going to do differently the next time. Was there something else in the chat or the Q&A? So other kinds of blind grading and such, right? Because we know that there is bias from teachers and instructors in their grading practices as well. They make assumptions about particular students based on everything from race, gender to class. You know, this is why the leaky pipeline, you have fewer women in sciences and STEM fields. You have fewer Black students in our, you know, colleges and graduate professional programs, right? So that validation is really important in really nurturing students of all ilk, right, toward education. And so if you see your role as an educator as one of liberation, as opposed to one of imparting specialized knowledge, then your interactions with your students will be very different.
Miriam,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I have a follow-up to the question. Partially, yes. I was wondering if vouchers from the government to pay private schools for low-income families is a good idea or not.
Yeah, this is another hot ticket, hot topic item, right? Because even in the public media, there's been a lot of debate around, well, the private vouchers and such are who gets to choose who gets them. Is it lobbying groups? So is it about party affiliation and how much fundraising you're doing that will get your district? You know, those vouchers versus other districts that are getting redlined and such, right? And so I think it's a much larger debate than just the vouchers themselves that get pulled into the conversation. I tend to not, you know, divulge my own political persuasions in general workshops because we want to make sure everyone's comfortable contributing and participating. But I think all of us, based on our own occupations, probably have particular kinds of politics because of what you see in your daily life playing out, right, with students in these different contexts. And so I'll stop with that. I'm going to move now to the other social movement I was thinking about covering with you quickly, and I won't take too much time on it because I know we have about 10 minutes left. But because Riverside recently declared racism as a public health crisis, I wanted to give you a local example of social movements happening in our region.
It's important for it to be noted that the conversation that's happening nationally is a very important one, but the circumstances aren't new.
They walk to express to the nation in a peaceful fashion their rights.
We're traumatized just by the systemic fact that we've been under oppression for over 400 years. And though we may not be on the bottom of boats anymore, but we certainly at the bottom of education. We may not be in the cotton fields for free labor, but you're certainly getting it from us now.
It all just comes down to that we're in a state of emergency because Black people are dying.
Clearly, I have missed the boat in some way as an elected leader. I recognize that. I now need help fixing that.
This resolution affirms that racism is a public health crisis that results in disparities in family stability, health, and mental health wellness, education, employment, economic development, public safety, criminal justice, and housing.
All those in favor?
Aye.
16 yeas.
This will finally give some teeth to some things that we've been working on here in Milwaukee County for quite some time.
It's 9-0 notes. The item is received and placed on file.
When you make a declaration and you tell people this is a crisis under CDC guidelines, now you have to do whatever you can to mitigate the crisis. We look at this as racism being the other pandemic that we're experiencing right now.
And really felt we've come to a cultural and societal moment where it is just pivotal that we say collectively, racism exists, it's been wrong, it's wrong now, and we have to join together and do everything we can to eliminate it.
And it's unfortunate that an event and a circumstance such as George Floyd had to happen for them to shine even, a light or get a closer lens into what disparities are affecting Black Americans. If we do not address this moment now, Black people are going to continue to remain in that cycling of suffering.
What I brought to the table on this was let's not just do a resolution, but let's have a plan for work after we pass it. And that's where I said, let's create an element group of the countywide vision to really dig into and work on the topic. And our shared goal is to identify, eliminate the effects and prevent racism.
It was all 5 yeses and no nos. I was excited, but then right at that moment, I couldn't celebrate too hard because I said, well, there's still work to be done. There's still work to be done. This isn't just a resolution. This is on paper, but we got to make sure that there's actionable steps put into place. This cannot be performative.
And in the 53206 zip code is a zip code that's nationally known for being the most incarcerated in the world. Wisconsin has been named the worst state in the nation to raise a Black child. I think it only made sense that we were the first to declare this a public health crisis. I'm proud. We created a vision statement for the first time in 20 years. This hadn't been done in 20 years, and our vision is very simple. We want to make Milwaukee the healthiest county in the state of Wisconsin by achieving racial equity. And that's what led to our racial equity ordinance, because we wanted to institutionalize this work and really make it law.
Everybody feels like it's time for government to take the lead to call it out. So as we come out of this COVID-19 crisis, we actually have to come out of this better than we went in.
I'm going to stop it there, but you get a sense of how systemic an approach you need to take, right? So that it's not just a resolution a city makes, but then what is the work of a social movement? How does it get embedded in all of our institutions and systems, right? So I'm going to show another video.
Our question is, how do we know that racism is affecting the health of people, all people in our country? I believe one of the things we're seeing, and particularly in primary care, is an increase in anxiety disorder and those pathologies associated with it. Hypertension, poor health choices, lifestyle problems, obesity, binge eating disorder, these kinds of chronic problems that we can no longer afford, as we're also beginning to have economic stresses on our healthcare finance. We have a campaign pushing back against the government or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to force them to do what they're empowered to do, which is prevent and control disease for the public. I believe racism meets that 4 criteria that they have for that threat, and we're trying to ask them to do their job, particularly now that we have evidence that it's directly related to everyone's health, not just the health of people of color. So CDC has 4 criteria for what constitutes a threat to public health. One is that it's a burden. It's an economic burden on the culture. The second is it's disproportionately shared by a section of the population, whether that be female, gay, pregnant, smoker. But the other is that it shows that current measures are not enough. So in other words, that problem is continuing despite what's being done currently. And the last one is that there's evidence that upstream change will affect that problem. In other words, institutionality, the institutional problem of it. What we're saying is racism meets those 4 criteria. So we're asking that CDC do their job, declare it a threat to public health, and then follow the protocol just like they did for other public health problems in the past. Zika, HIV, smoking, diabetes, these other campaigns. The way that we want to do that is it needs to be effectively, definitively, and publicly announced as the threat that it is. That way, people can then begin to speak about racism and less about health disparities, social determinants of health, these other code words that have currently been used. We are saying if CDC will do that, we will begin to save the disproportionate number of healthcare dollars, lives, unfortunate incarceration, gun death. So much of the underlying cause will be mitigated, and that money will be saved and put into education, healthcare, the kinds of things that we now know have been neglected instead. Because in primary care, the idea is not just to treat the symptom, we pursue the cause of the symptom. It seemed only reasonable to apply that to this particular inequity. As time has gone on,
I'm going to stop there. And so health disparities and health equity issues, right, plague us in many different ways that we don't often think about, right? Health insurance coverage, for example, Latinx individuals are 2.5 times more likely to be uninsured than white folks. Access to and the use of care, right? Individuals living below the poverty line are 4 times more likely to be uninsured. Non-elderly people of color are less likely to seek preventable care than whites, right? Often because of access issues and proximity and such. There's clinician bias in our practitioners, right? The way doctors, medical professionals ask people for information or interview, the assumptions they make with their diagnostic decision-making, the ways they interpret symptoms, right? Their treatment recommendations. Well, why do you recommend certain antibiotics for them and just, diet recommendations for others, right? And whether or not they refer the patients to specialty care. There's interpersonal behavior that leads to either more or less patient trust. There's also systemic institutional forms, right? Lack of economic access in terms of welfare reform policies, right? Who qualifies and who doesn't qualify for eligibility. There are deficits in hospital and healthcare institutions. You know, Riverside as a county is like the lowest resourced county in the state around particular health needs like mental health resources. So the adoption, administration, implementations of policies and funding practices often also lead to inequities and racial disparities in our health provisions. Lack of physicians and other providers is another big regional challenge we have in Riverside County and San Bernardino County. And then discriminatory policies and practices still in some of our healthcare industries, redlining particular hospitals and community centers and such, right? Lack of culturally competent language in our care materials, and then disparities in the treatment practices themselves. And then in the training of physicians and such, and medical residencies and such, there's also all kinds of discrimination and microaggressions in that educational structure, right? So the expectations of productivity rates by Black and minoritized doctors get less promotion than rates of white colleagues getting promoted, right? Assumptions about youthfulness and gender and race and ethnicity made about one another by their colleagues as well as by their patients, right? African-American doctors report being called racial epithets and people refusing to be serviced by them or examined by them. Asian American physicians reported being, demeaned by also racist stereotypes. Different kinds of gender discrimination in medicine as well, right? I know we're reaching the end of time, so I'm just going to move along. But what you can do individually in terms of knowing your rights, confronting your own biases, consulting subject matter experts, being a co-conspirator, being an active bystander, encouraging other bystanders, and really for us to all think about how institutionality, organizations can perpetuate these kinds of harm and inequities. That's, you can do your part in any of these social justice movements, right? If you can intervene in the process as a whole. And so I wanted to end on a slide that is about education and public health that could lead to a sense of liberation and joy, right? So this is just a snippet of our Black graduation, and all of our folks go to the general graduation as well, but they also have kind of culturally ethnic specific graduations as well. What sort of Black celebratory educational liberation looks like. And there was an amusing moment because our community members told us, Jelani Bakari was telling us that afterwards, a lot of the families went and, they pinned or put money into the graduates' kind of clothing and such. And other folks thought it was like inappropriate kind of touching practices. And some had to explain to others, oh, this is a particular African, tradition that we do and such. So you can see like even within internal communities that diversity work goes on, right? So I'm gonna stop there.
We do have a couple of questions for you, Miriam.
Okay.
Do you feel the momentum of true social change has increased significantly in the light of the recent court decision regarding the murder of George Floyd and the declaration of racism as a public health crisis in many jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think attention and sensitivity to, racial politics has been growing for the last, I would say, 6 years maybe, right? And with Black Lives Matter, but also with the changing political climates and the increasing polarization around racial politics and those tensions, I think more and more people are joining the conversation when they used to maybe hesitate being part of that conversation, right? And as you know, Black and brown folks in the community often say, we can't stop racism on our own, right? Like we need white allies, we need everyone to see this as a public health threat for everyone, not just folks of color, right? And so I think those kinds of conversations are important, and that I think the momentum that's building is a healthy momentum, and that hopefully it won't be just a temporary trend, right? And that people kind of keep the efforts going. Even on our campus, many departments who have always had maybe tensions in their department, when last summer when the George Floyd first erupted, all of a sudden we're getting all kinds of requests from departments really wanting to do better and deal with their racial tensions in their departments, and such the grad students, the junior faculty, everybody was really like seized the moment to actually intervene in their own spaces, right? And I think with the Derek Chauvin trial verdict, we were very careful, as you know, it was a very stressful week and day for higher ed campuses, because we were preparing statements for both possible verdict outcomes. I know municipal police and campus police were preparing for possible protests, all kinds of things. And it was important to, in the statements, to think about, not just saying, oh, justice is served, right? Because one case in which justice was served relative to centuries of cases where justice may not have been served would be overstatement. And we didn't want to belittle that history, right? And the larger kind of challenges. And so I think in many of the public media forums, you saw folks talking about, that this was a huge relief for not just the Floyd family, but many African Americans, and that Black Americans, and that but this was only just, sort of one step, and they're still waiting for sentencing. And that since George Floyd, literally you're seeing like another Black person getting killed every day in the news media. And there was a statistic recently that there were only 11 days in the past year where there wasn't someone killed by a law enforcement officer, and debate what you will, but that's a startling statistic, right? 11 days with no death in that context is startling. And so I hope that the momentum does continue in terms of raising more conversation and awareness about it. And of course, some of the polarization will continue as well, but the more we're willing to sort of talk across political differences, the more we can educate one another towards our mutual liberation.
So I actually have a question. And you might already have answered it because towards the end, but what next steps would you like to see the City of Riverside implement to address diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Oh, there's so many things the city can do, and residents can do, and citizens of the county and city can do. And I think our new mayor is trying really hard. I know from the Mayor's Multicultural Forum conversations that they're working on hiring a chief diversity officer for the city, who would work closely with all the city institutions and organizations and different, arenas, to work on real implementations and incorporations of practices, right, that would intervene in many of these inequities and forms of discrimination. And so that's a promising. I know our campus has been in conversations with the district attorney's office to hopefully create a restorative transformative justice program for misdemeanors and redirection of cases that could keep not only students but other community members and youth and such out of long-term effects of the criminal and justice system. And so these are just, a few of the things. Our School of Medicine is very much about, we reserve certain numbers of admits for our regional students and such, and local undergrads and such. And so I think we're doing a lot as a city and as a county to really improve the inequities that already exist in our, medical system and our educational system and our criminal justice system. But everybody should try to, meet people where they are, participate in whatever form of social justice work you are comfortable doing. You don't need to force yourself to get involved in things where you're still not sure or uneasy. But if you're curious about a topic or an issue or a theme, that's a good way to kind of learn more and introduce yourself to like, what are the controversies around charter vouchers for public school, private schools and such, right? Like the earlier question.
Well, thank you. I want to give everyone a few minutes to see if we get any last minute comments or questions. A couple seconds.
Thank you all for staying to the end.
Okay, so I think we're actually all set now. I think you answered everyone's questions, so that's pretty awesome. Thank you. So I'm gonna do this. So I want to thank Miriam Lam today for participating in our last Riverside Reads event. It has been a great honor to have her here for 2 events, and we truly appreciate everything you have done for us. I want to also thank Aaron Christmas for being involved as well and giving Miriam Lam a great intro. And I want to thank Nancy Walker and Scott, who have also helped produce this event today. And most importantly, I want to thank all of our attendees today for joining us. We appreciate all your questions. They bring up great discussions, and it helps us to just build these talks with one another. You will see Nancy posting something in the chat. It's going to be some contact information. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out and contact me. We will be posting all of these videos that we recorded on our website. Follow us on social media for more details for that to come. And you're also going to see a link posted in the chat. Again, that link is to a survey for Center for the Book. Filling that out actually helps build more programs like this and provides funding for us to continue to do this every year. And I just want to again thank everyone for joining us. So I hope everyone has a great evening. Mariam, do you have anything else to say tonight?
No, just to thank you, Joseph and Nancy, Scott, and Aaron for your programming and the enthusiasm and investment of time and energy and commitment to the work.
This was so enjoyable, Mariam. You make me want to go back to school.
Okay. Well, again, thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.